Family and Social Services Administration and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, among other funders. Dr. Laura Schwab Reese is the current president for the Society for the Advancement of Violence and Injury Research, and SAVR. And I guess we should also announce that the registration for the SAVR conference is open. Early bird deadline is March 1st. Please join us in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for that conference. All right. And with that, thank you, Laura. You have your slides open. I'll turn it over to you. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ashley. And I will reinforce, please come to the SAVR conference. Ashley is the incoming president, and so you'll get to see her take the stage as the president at the conference. So I'll be transitioning. I'll be presenting some work today that my colleagues and I have done using text and chat hotlines, which are one emerging way to provide child maltreatment related support to young people. And before I go any further, I just want to take a moment to recognize the funding that we received from the Children's Bureau, which supported both research, but also the hotline itself. So I'm going to start with some bad news. Thankfully, it will only get better from here. But in this country, there are more than 7.5 million children reported to Child Protective Services every year. And that's been pretty stable across the last several years. And that's bad enough news. But the worst news is that this number likely underestimates the true scope of maltreatment. We know that some children, some very young people, are recognized by the signs and symptoms that they have related to maltreatment. But older people, older children, young adults, they generally have to disclose their experiences in order to be recognized. And in a perfect world, that would happen a lot. People would be experiencing maltreatment, they would reach out to someone for help, they would get the help they need, and then everyone would continue on their merry way. But unfortunately, that isn't how the world works for many young people. And we've seen this in many different elements of my research, but for many young people, the disclosure process itself compounds their trauma. Young people often report that when they try to share about abuse that's happening at home, they feel isolated, they feel disrespected, and they feel like nothing happens. And as a result, most adolescents, it's actually only a minority of adolescents, are willing to share about child maltreatment, which is bad for lots of reasons. But in particular, it prevents them from receiving the services that they need. So they are kind of stuck in this unhealthy, unsafe environment at home without feeling like there's anyone that they can go to get help. And I said the presentation would get more positive, and this is the moment in which we'll start being more positive. So when I was the Berger Fellow at the Kempe Center, which is at the University of Colorado, I started working with Crisis Text Line and found in Crisis Text Line that lots of young people were willing to use text and chat to talk about maltreatment. And this was a big step because they were reaching out to adults, and adults tend to be the group that people disclose to the least. So it was really promising to see there are lots of people willing to talk to a crisis counselor at Crisis Text Line about abuse. We replicated some of that work in Talk Life, which is an online peer-to-peer support network. So we know that technology seems to reduce some of the barriers that young people have to talking about abuse. And as I was doing this work, it's one of those really happy coincidences that I was doing some of this work. And at the same time, Child Help was realizing that their hotline wasn't reaching young people. They had had a hotline since about 1985, but it was primarily adults. And they were like, well, we know that kids are, talking to other people. They actually saw some of my research published, but they're not talking to us. What do we need to do so that young people will talk to us? And ultimately, they decided to launch the text and chat arms of their hotline. And in the first 6 months, so in 2019, they saw tremendous growth. In the first month, there were over 100 conversations through, it was just chat at that point. As they added text over the next several months, demand almost tripled. And since then, the growth has continued, to put it lightly. There are between 1,500 and 2,000 text and chat conversations every month. And one of the things that I love about Child Help is that they're so focused on making evidence-based decisions and evidence-based practices. So from the very beginning, they started offering surveys after conversations that ranged in questions from, do you feel less stressed after you went through this conversation? Do you feel better prepared? Are you more hopeful? And overall, we see that between 75 and 80% of people do feel better about life, I guess I'll say, after the conversations. But Child Help thought that's 20 to 25% of people who aren't getting what they need from their service. They're not more hopeful. They're not feeling better prepared. Their stress isn't reduced. And so they thought we could do better. We want to do better, which is why they decided to reach out to me. So they knew that I was doing qualitative work in this area, and said, we have these transcripts. They save all of the transcripts from text and chat. And they came to me and said, how can we use this data? We have piles and piles of data. How can we use it to make the service better? And ultimately, we want to provide the most accessible, most appropriate services to young people. And so we talked. I ended up going through a formal bidding process with them. And we ultimately decided to use qualitative content analysis, which is one of my favorite approaches to qualitative work. I'll talk a little bit more about it in just a second. But we used stratified random sampling of 314 conversations that happened in July 2020. So we were particularly interested in this approach to understanding a wide range of experiences. So we wanted to make sure that we had boys and girls represented in our sample. We wanted a diverse, racially diverse sample. We wanted people who had both really good outcomes and people who had really bad outcomes or reported outcomes in the post-conversation survey. So what we ended up with was a really good cross-section of all of the different ways that these conversations could go. And like I said, just a little bit ago, we used qualitative content analysis, which is a little bit different from much of the qualitative work that's done. I started doing qualitative work when I was the Berger Fellow at Kempe, and my quantitative brain found it to be really squishy. And it took me a while to get my brain wrapped around it. So I like to think of qualitative content analysis as qualitative methods for quantitative brained people. It tends to be a very concrete research question, and we only focus on the relevant information. And I really like that because we had 314 conversations, we had thousands and thousands and thousands of words, and in some other types of qualitative work, I found myself just spinning, like, oh, there's so much here. Where do I start? Where do I, what's the best approach? And in qualitative content analysis, you start with your research questions. So you really hone in on only the data that's relevant to your research questions. There's also a really heavy emphasis on standardizing processes and the approach to coding, so that basically it doesn't matter if I apply the code book or my students apply the code book or my collaborators apply the code book. We're really honed in, and the coders are consistent across each other, which is something that's not necessarily as important in other approaches. So just to give you a little bit of perspective on the scope of and how big this project got, I said that we started with 314 conversations. We ended up with over 15,000 excerpts. There were 109 codes, and we ended up applying those codes almost 21,000 times, which ends up being a lot of data. And part of the reason that we applied codes and had so many codes is that we really had 3 research questions that were rolled into one. So first, we wanted to know how conversations progressed We wanted to know if it seemed like there were a consistent order to the types of things that were being discussed. Second, we wanted to know content that's being shared. And then finally, we wanted to understand how crisis counselors were attending to the emotional aspects of the conversations. So many of the young people who were reaching out were in crisis. So there was a need to not just provide information and resources, but to also help them de-escalate the situation. We know a fair amount, not a huge amount, but we know a fair amount about how that works in verbal conversation. So we know how counseling works, or a little bit about how counseling works. We know how crisis services work, but we don't know very much about how this happens in written conversations. And this was a particular interest of mine because it's kind of messy, kind of squishy, but it's really the difference between someone feeling at the end of the conversation like they were heard, like they matter, like they have a path forward, and feeling like someone just spewed information at them. So this is something that's really important that we get it right. And I like to think about those 3 research questions as if we were building a house. I don't know when I came up with this analogy, but it tends to be one that I use a lot now when talking about this work. So if our research questions were like building a house, the conversation progression would be like putting up the studs and framing the house. It's that very basic framework and the basic direction of the conversation. And we found that overall, there were 5 stages to these conversations, and that for the most part, they happened in a pretty linear fashion. So there would be an introduction and clarifying what the agency was able to provide. They would talk about the issue. They would work on problem solving. They would talk about and connect around the resolution. Did it feel like the help seeker got what they needed? And then there would be a wrap up. And we saw some going back and forth in, for example, resolution and issue exploration. If they get to the end and they realize the help seeker didn't get what they needed, then they circle back and try to address that. When we think about the content that's being discussed, this is I'm going to call it stuff. It's my technical term that fills in the conversation framework. So it's putting up the walls, it's finishing the floor, if we continue the house analogy. So it's a completed conversation, but it's not necessarily a warm, friendly conversation yet. As you look at this blank white house, you probably don't say, yes, I want to spend a ton of time here. And that is what the content is. So I've split these results into the 3 most common types of help seekers. So these are kids who are seeking support for themselves. These are peers and friends who are seeking support for another child, and then family. And we found that there were 4 types of content that were shared during these conversations. This primarily happened during issue exploration and problem solving, because those are the real heart of the conversation. You may or may not be familiar with this type of figure, but each color in the plot represents a different type of content. The colors are then broken into smaller boxes that represent the subcategories. And the area shows what proportion of the conversation was spent focusing on each of these kinds of content. So you can see the blue color is information needs. So that's asking for information or giving information. About half of the conversation with maltreated or distressed children is spent on those information needs. About a quarter of the time is spent giving advice, and the remaining time is about evenly split between problem solving and resources. That looks a little bit different for peers and family. We see much more time is spent on resources in those kinds of conversations. Which brings us to the last research question, which is the emotional aspects of the conversation. And it's through these elements that conversations become warm and supportive and welcoming. It's the difference between being in that bland, empty house, like on the last slide, and a space that feels comfortable and feels warm. And these emotional aspects were by far the hardest part of the conversations to categorize. We ended up with about 12 different types of emotional attending, which are represented in these pie charts. I know the figures are quite busy, So I'll go ahead and highlight just a couple of important points. So first, this purple color is validation. So validating is basically expressing, I see you, I hear you, your experience is reasonable, your experience is valid, it's happening to you. This is something that's done quite a lot in all of the kinds of conversations. On the other hand, gratitude, which is this blue teal color, often was expressing thanks for reaching out. This was the largest part of the conversations that happened with peers and friends, but it's less present in conversations with families, and it's even less present in conversations with maltreated or distressed kiddos. Conversely, apologizing about the situation, this darker green color here, happens quite a lot in conversations with maltreated or distressed kids, but much less in some of the other conversations. So I have given you a very quick and dirty version of the results. We used and have a much deeper, richer understanding of the results, which we used to build a practice model for the hotline. So the practice model was intended to guide crisis counselors through the conversation using what we learned about what works best, connecting what we saw in conversations to those post-conversation survey outcomes that said, I like this conversation, I'm feeling more hopeful. What was it about those conversations that tended to result in those outcomes? And we distilled it down into this practice model. So we built it around the 5 phases that we often see, but it's not a linear process. We wanted crisis counselors to recognize that they could go around again, or they could circle back to earlier stages of the conversations if they needed to. We also have at the core of every conversation being empathetic, person-centered, and clear. I often said, as we were trying to develop the practice model, people just need to be these 3 things. Like if we could just get every crisis counselor to be these 3 things, every conversation would be excellent. But it's hard to be those things sometimes. So the rest of the practice model provides a little bit of structure for how to implement that in a conversation. You'll also note that we don't have any conversation prompts. So it can be common in a practice model to have like, say this kind of thing or say that kind of thing. And we decided against doing that because crisis text line Child Help has exclusively professionals. So most of their staff are trained mental health providers. They are all paid, which is different from volunteer-based organizations. And we saw in these conversations that it works best if the professional who has all of this experience and expertise is able to be genuine and to use their true voice. So we try to guide people or guide the crisis counselors rather than telling them, say this, say this, say this. We also have some underlying meanings. So these are things like, what are you trying to do when you explore the issue? You're trying to convey in your emotional dynamics that you want to understand. And you want to understand because you care. You're not just digging around in people's background and experiences because you are nosy or you are investigating them. You do it because you want to help them create good solutions. And it's only if you understand that you can do that. So after we developed the practice model, we started to identify competencies. So those are the skills, the attitude, the knowledge that counselors need to implement the practice model. So they were things like their perspectives on what's reasonable for a help seeker, and their beliefs about burnout or about self-care. Skills were things like how to establish rapport, how to assess safety, how to gently suggest or nudge possible options. And knowledge was things like how might trauma or crisis manifest in these conversations. So once we had figured out what we wanted people to do and the knowledge, attitudes, and skills that they needed, we then tried to figure out how can we help the counselors maintain fidelity to the model. And so we went through, we reviewed their existing training, which is already quite comprehensive. And we added in specific text and chat related trainings. So there were a series of things where we focused on how to improve the clarity of your communication, for example, how to build rapport through effective listening. And both of those things are difficult enough in spoken language, but when you strip out all of the nuance of body positioning or tone or pace, you're left with just these, black and white words on a page, which can be misunderstood much more easily. So at one point we gave a training on grammar. It had been a long time for many of the counselors since they took grammar training, or had grammar training. So we broke down what is the anatomy of clear grammar, which was not something I ever thought that I would be providing training on, but we found that, counselors who were very clear in their language tended to communicate better with help seekers than people who were using less clear language or grammar. So we spent a lot of time in that clarity and conveying emotion through writing. We also talked about setting boundaries and how to redirect your approach when things aren't working. Each of those trainings had videos and practice challenges and reflection opportunities. And then we bundled those into 3 different modules that also had lectures about things like adolescent development and how trauma manifests. Because we found that as a primarily adult-focused hotline for many years, it was hard sometimes for counselors to talk to adolescents again. They were used to talking to adults. So reminding them that adolescents are different than adults. You can't talk to them in the same way and expect the same kinds of results. We also began to introduce the practice model very early in people's process. So they actually started talking about the practice model in interviews, and it became a foundation of new hire training. So from the very first moment that people started working as a crisis counselor, they were exposed to the practice model. And specifically, we emphasized effective listening and everything that goes along with that, setting boundaries, how to be responsive to help seeker needs, and then self-care, because it can be challenging to have conversations with young people about abuse for many hours a week. When I was doing the research, I was not the one having to produce content. I was not having to respond, but it was still pretty emotionally taxing to be sitting and reading for hours at a time. These are the horrible things that are happening to kids. And here's the things that they've tried, and here's the things that don't work. And unlike some other types of helping modalities, crisis counselors don't get to know what happens. It's not like you're a mental health provider that you see the same person multiple times and you get to see, oh, things are going better, things are not going better, we can change directions. Crisis counselors only have one moment in time. So they don't get that resolution, that feeling like what they've done is making a huge difference, and they get to see that. So in addition to really embedding the practice model into all aspects of training, it's also the foundation for monthly evaluations. So Child Help uses reflective supervision, which encourages counselors and supervisors to collectively think about what's going well and what are some challenges that the counselor is having. So as part of this, Child Help created monthly reflection sheets. I'll share one of those in just a minute. But it helps people think through whether they're implementing the practice model. My collaborators like to use the word, are they living into it? So the supervisors will ask, do you feel like you're living into the practice model? Or where are you not living into the practice model? And these monthly supervisions are not like HR kind of supervision. It's not like that kind of annual review It's more a check-in where both the counselor and the supervisor have a chance to talk about and reflect on what's going well or not. So this is an example of a monthly supervision checklist. So the counselors and the supervisor are asked, and I can't remember what the rating scale is. I think it's some sort of Likert scale, but you can see here that the practice model is embedded throughout their monthly supervision. So that warmth and the professionalism relate to that center core. Are they being person-centered and clear? Under warmth, you can see counselors are asked to reflect on whether they communicated in a way that encourages help seekers to feel heard and understood and validated. Did they use a warm, friendly tone? Were they actively listening? So for all of the practice model components, and then some other important things like documentation, they need to be documenting appropriately. They're asked to reflect on how well all of this is going. And the reflections aren't punitive. I said they weren't like an HR annual evaluation kind of thing. It's more trying to figure out what kinds of support crisis counselors need. So if it seems like a counselor is struggling with warmth, they're just not conveying warmth. Is it because they don't know how? Is it because they're exhausted? Is it because there's something going on in their lives that they don't feel warmth for anyone? So if that's the case, then it's the goal of child help and the supervisors to help them troubleshoot that, to help, if it's a skill problem, to help create opportunities for them to practice those skills or to work on that during supervision. If it's, burnout, trying to figure out what the system could do to better support them, what kinds of self-care need to be implemented in the workplace. So the practice model became really a foundation of how services were supposed to be provided and how people's, it was built in monthly. So it wasn't something that we created and then it sat on the shelf. It really became an integral part of how child help provided services. So I'm going to transition just a little bit here. I've talked a lot about the research that we conducted and how we translated that to child help practice. But we're going to switch gears and start talking about computer science, which probably feels like a hard switch in the direction of the conversation. But if you think about it, there were thousands of conversations every month that we, the research team or child help, can't process. It took us more than a year to fully process the 314 conversations in our first sample. You would need a huge research team, a ton of money to be able to process that many conversations in a timely fashion. And so we started asking ourselves, is there some sort of technology solution? And we ultimately thought that natural language processing might be something that's helpful. You may know the term natural language processing or large language models. They have been all over the news. If you haven't heard those words, you've probably heard the words ChatGPT. But I found that the media doesn't always give a very realistic view of this technology. So I'm going to take a little step back and explain a bit more about natural language processing, which I'll also refer to as NLP. So NLP is a discipline focused on building machines that can process data that looks like human language. And within NLP, there are two subfields. So there's an area that's focused on understanding the meaning of the text, and there's an area focused on generating text or creating language. And even if you're not using ChatGPT regularly, NLP is still probably a part of your daily life. There are all sorts of ways that NLP is already kind of integrated into our lives, but I think spam detection, particularly for academics who get a bajillion emails is something that's very present in our lives. I know it's probably the most prominent NLP application in my life and in my ever overflowing inbox. So if your inbox has a spam folder, or if it's like mine and somehow you have a spam folder and a junk folder and a quarantine email that you get every day, that is built on NLP technology. So there's an algorithm that reviews the text of the email and characteristics of the email. Like, do you email with this person often? Is it someone who's in your organization? And it looks for indicators that it may or may not be spam. So I think beyond being a good example of NLP in your real life, I think the spam folder is also a really good example of how these algorithms may or may not get it right. So I still get tons of spam messages, and I also get quote unquote good emails that get caught in the spam folder. So I think in society, in the media, often talk about these technologies as being really, really good and really, really accurate. But if you have ever had to navigate a spam folder that both is too porous and also not porous enough, you can tell that, you know, it's good technology, but it's not perfect technology. But we thought it was promising enough that we wanted to give it a go. So we have a few goals for natural language processing. First, ultimately, we want to build an overlay that helps provide counselors helps counselors provide evidence-based resources. So I want to be really clear up front that we don't think using natural language processing to replace counselors is a good idea. And actually, there have been several examples of, one particularly prominent example of a crisis hotline that started using natural language processing chatbots to provide services, and it ended up being quite a disaster. I won't throw too much shade, but in essence, the chatbot started providing exactly the opposite type of resource that it was intended to. So it was intended to be for people who were recovering from eating disorder or seeking to start a recovery journey, and the chatbot ended up providing diet advice. So, you know, even if the technology is not yet good enough, that we can trust that it would stay on topic and within the bounds of the kinds of service that we want it to provide. But second, we saw that the emotional dynamics and the emotional connection between the crisis counselor and the help seeker are really critical to the helping service. We've seen this in our research. It's been presented in other research. There's something really special about knowing when you're in a crisis that someone else in the world is taking time out of their day to be present with you and to care about you. And no computer can do that, because at least at this point, computers can't care about you. So we don't want to replace our counselors, and we don't want anyone to replace their counselors with chatbots. But we think that there are ways that natural language processing can be used to help support counselors. So if, for example, we have an overlay that starts to prompt counselors with evidence-based resources that are likely to be a good fit or likely to be well received by this help seeker, they then don't have to be digging around for that. They can just focus on being present with the person and providing that emotional support. Our second goal is to use natural language processing to assist with CQI efforts. So right now, counselors and supervisors are reading over a selection of transcripts every month as part of reflexive supervision. It tends to be a pretty time-consuming process for them. We think that there are ways that natural language processing can summarize, can be trained on the practice model, and can identify specific instances that are a good example of adherence to the practice model, or examples of something that could have been done differently. And we think it can be done in a much faster way than is currently done. But our intermediate goal, because goal 1 and goal 2 are somewhat lofty at this point, our intermediate goal was to identify how well natural language processing could replicate or could extend our current qualitative analysis. So that first step involves, can the classifiers, can these algorithms identify instances of the main conversational features, which is natural language processing speak for, can it essentially do the qualitative coding that we had already done? And so we pulled out from the 109 codes, we pulled out the codes that we thought were most relevant to the outcomes. So those were the emotional attending codes, those were the information need codes, the problem solving codes, and then the providing resources. So we essentially, I'm going to use the word magic, although later in the talk I'll say that computer science isn't magic. But we essentially tried to train a model to say, here's how a human does this. Can you replicate it? And what we found is that somewhat. We looked at macro F1 scores. We're getting into the part of the talk that I am no longer the expert on the research team. My computer science colleagues are the experts. So I will probably say things that are more general than they would prefer to be the way I describe things. But essentially, macro F1 is a type of accuracy. So higher numbers indicate correctly identifying the presence and the absence of a code within each segment of the conversation. And we looked at both the fine grain coding, so how well could a model identify these features, and we also looked at how well a model could identify these higher level features here. So the first 4 models that we tried were focused on those fine grain features, the more specific kinds of codes, and we ended up with a macro F1 score of 56, which is not great. I believe it ranges from 0 to 100, and you want to be, or at least the way that my computer science colleagues were talking, we wanted to be in the 70s and 80s, really ideally in the 90s, but a 56 was not great. We got to a 69 in the grouped features. So when we were looking at these 4 general types of features, we got to a 69, which is not bad. Not exceptional, but not bad. So in the second step, we tried to identify, can large language models accurately predict help seekers' perceptions of the conversations? So can a large language model read a conversation and be able to say at the end, this is likely a conversation that the help seeker thinks really well, or is this a conversation that the help seeker thinks probably didn't go so well? And we had 5 different possible outcomes. We chose to focus on, do help seekers feel more positive? Because we thought that that one was likely to be a good balance of information needs and support needs. So what we ended up with were models that looked at an assortment of different features. So we had models that looked at just the conversation text. So it's just the transcript read into the large language model. There were conversations and counseling codes. So these counseling codes are the qualitative analysis that we did. So we basically fed the large language model both the conversation text itself and also the coding or the qualitative analysis that we had done. We fed it the conversation and large language model features, meaning asking the large language model itself to identify features that it thought were important. And then we also had models that included both of those. So included both our counseling or qualitative analysis annotations and also the features thought to be important by the large language model. And these are the different models that we ran and the F1 scores here. And we crossed 50, although 50 is still not great. Our most accurate model was the one that used conversation and counseling codes, or the qualitative analysis codes that we used. So it still wasn't great. So we went ahead and attempted an alternate approach, where we were far more specific in what we were asking of the large language model. And so we would prompt it with a system message. So we told the large language model who it was, and what its role was. We then fed it the conversation and then gave it the instruction, don't answer in sentences, answer by choosing one from the given categories. And then we had categories, which were the features of the qualitative content analysis results. So for example, so we ended up asking it a bunch of different questions using that format. So we would ask it to identify who the help seeker was, for example. So it would go all of this, the system message, the conversation, the instruction, and then who is the help seeker? And it would spit back who it thought the help seeker was. We did that for the likely perpetrator, the type of abuse, so characteristics of the abuse, counselors' responses, counselor strategies, a whole range of possible features. We then also ask it to summarize in 150 words the conversation, and then summarize that with a stance. So summarize the conversation in 150 words, focusing on whether the help seeker would likely have felt more positive. And then finally, we ask it, would the help seeker likely have felt more positive after the conversation? We ask it to dichotomize 0 or 1. So just to give you a sense of what that looked like in practice, we would have asked for the prompt, what are the things suggested by the counselor to resolve the situation? We would have positioned the large language model as a helpful assistant, given it the conversation, then ask it, what are the things suggested by the counselor to resolve the situation, given it the instruction, and then given it the possible categories that we identified in the qualitative content analysis. So we did that for each of the possible features, in part to help the large language model process the conversation in a structured way. And I am happy to say that our F1 scores for this approach tended to get much better. So when we look at just the conversation itself, the F1 score was about a 62. And then we added on models that allowed for the counseling codes, a model that allowed for the counseling codes, the baseline, and the large language model prompts. And basically went through all of the 4 different kinds of information that were available. So I've included the model that functioned the best, although we assessed between 3 and 7 different options for each of these kinds of models. Ultimately, we found that a model that included the counseling codes, the large language model prompts, the summary question, and the stance question, and then used logistic regression, was the most accurate at a 71.29. So we finally cracked into those 70s. But I haven't talked about recall yet. And recall is basically how we tell how many of our true positives we identified. So we were trying to figure out our true positive in this instance was people who reported that they weren't more positive. And the difference is that the F1 score tells us our overall accuracy. So it includes both people who felt more positive and people who did not feel more positive. How accurate is the model at identifying those? Where the recall is just focused on how well are we identifying people who do not feel more positive. And because such a large majority of our sample had positive outcomes, we can still be very accurate without correctly identifying most of the people with those less positive outcomes. And the recall actually suggests that we still weren't very good at identifying people who were not more positive, which is not the not the outcome that I was hoping for. I was hoping for a more accurate outcome. But I think we learned a lot through this process, and we have some next step goals. We still think there's a lot of promise here, but there's going to be far more scaffolding that's needed and far more kind of human computer interaction that's needed, which we're hoping to do through future grants. So I'm going to wrap up with just some lessons that we learned. So this conversation covered everything from research to practice translation and bringing computer science in. So just some quick reflections. First, it takes a lot of time to make data-driven decisions. So when you're thinking about projects, make sure that you give yourself enough time to really get in the data and process it. It took us almost a year before we had any recommendations for child help, but they were willing to give us that year. And that meant then we were able to make changes really quickly after that. But you have to know your data, you have to understand your data before you can make those recommendations. Second, collaborative relationships are really key. And this goes along with finding the right people for the job. I happen to be working with a bunch of people who are really in it for the same reasons that I am. Like, I'm in it because I want child support services to be better, and I want kids to have better access to better services. And child help was right there with me. And I happened to find computer scientists who were also right there with me. They can be computer scientists are not public health. They're not driven by some of the same pro-social things that we are always, but finding collaborators who were driven by improving those services really helped improve that collaboration. I also say that you have to be really humble when you're doing research to practice, because you're going to get things wrong. Like you as the researcher are going to get things wrong. You as the community partner are going to get things wrong. And that's the beauty of these community academic partnerships. Like, you both have two really important parts of this story, and by working together, you can tell a more comprehensive story and make better decisions. And then finally, computer science isn't magic. As much as I wanted it to be magic, I had this beautiful idea that, like, we give things to ChatGPT and ChatGPT tells us about ourselves, and it's way more complicated than that. So I think that's important both for research, but also as you're just navigating your day-to-day life and hearing about large language models or ChatGPT. This is science, this isn't magic. And it's good, but it's not infallible at this point. So I think it has promise, but it's not, it's not magic. So at this point, I think we have about 10 minutes left. I would love to open for questions if people have them.
Thank you, Laura. I am happy to ask the first question, but for any of you who have questions, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if you prefer, raise your hand. You're welcome to come off video or not, or just jump in there. But to kick things off, I have kind of a broad question. I think many of us, especially maybe those of us who know less about the natural language processing, I'll put myself in that boat, do have very optimistic hopes that somehow we can apply these emerging AI technologies to assist in research, make QI easier, make the work easier. And I'm kind of curious what your observations are of how much, I'm sure the corporate world, business interests are engaging in a lot of these technologies for their purposes. And I'm wondering how much you're seeing that kind of influence research, public health research, like what that conversation is like, how much we're drawing on what they're doing, and does it matter given that our interests are so different, or do things kind of translate from other applications of natural language processing, or these sorts of methods?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, because things like ChatGPT cost millions and millions of dollars and tons of time to develop. And so researchers, for the most part, don't have the resources. Like, this is a whole company's entire purpose in life, is to create things like ChatGPT. And so they're acquiring funding like a tech company does, which means that for the most part, researchers are tied in some way to what's already been developed by these companies. And I have started wondering quite a lot about what kinds of values and what kinds of assumptions these companies are baking into their platforms. So even things that are less sophisticated than ChatGPT, some of the earlier natural language processing approaches are still developed by often a corporate entity and then used by other people. And so I think it's something that we in public health need to be really cognizant of. And I don't yet know exactly what that means for us, but we're starting to adopt in public health. And I think we're seeing this in using AI to develop public health messages, to develop social media messages. What is it that we're unintentionally baking into our messaging because we're using technology developed by corporate partners who may not share our values? So it's a really tough question. And I think at this point, we really just need to be very cognizant of the things that are produced by something like ChatGPT. You need to really carefully process, ChatGPT thinks this message is something we should put on social media. Do we as public health really believe that this is something that should be on social media? I think my kind of long-term goal / pie in the sky is that we create pro-social algorithms that like public health and medicine and everybody else in the world who want happy, healthy people get together and are like, we don't want to be tied to corporate algorithms anymore. We want algorithms that are based in the values and the assumptions that we hold dear in the discipline, and we create our own. But like I said, that it's millions and millions of dollars and tons of time. So I don't know how quickly we'll get there, if we'll get there.
Carol, you can ask the next question. I can read it for you, but since you're off camera.
Sure. I thought I was on camera.
Yeah, on camera. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Fascinating, Laura, to hear what you've been working on. I'm just curious to know sort of what's the next step in this line of research, where you go from here.
Yeah, so I recently got a K01 from NICHD that I'm focusing on. Thank you. I'm focusing on developing expertise in computational analytics. What I learned from this project was that I wanted computer science to be magic. And when it wasn't magic, I was like, I don't understand. Like, why isn't this doing what I want it to do? Like, I'm telling it to do something and then it's not doing it. Like, why aren't you working? And that was really frustrating for me because I wanted to understand why it was working and why it wasn't working. So I have been learning Python, which is a computer language or a computer programming language. And I'll be taking graduate classes in computational analytics and natural language processing, in part so that I can be a better collaborator, so that when I come to a computer scientist and I say, I want it to do this, I understand, what it actually is possibly feasibly able to do, and ask better research questions in that way. But the next research step for me is trying to create some interventions that allow young people to connect with what is basically a chatbot in a non-emotional support kind of way. So we did some research based in the Child Help website that showed that 60% of people who were coming to the platform didn't feel like they could talk to a person. That even though it was anonymous, even though it was someone that they didn't know, like there could be no tracking back to them, they were scared of what a parent would do if they found out that, if the child found out, sorry, let me start that over. The children were scared of what would happen to them if a parent found out they told someone, so they couldn't talk to a person. So I'm hoping that things like natural language processing and other, as they evolve, large language models can be used to provide better resources. You know, so rather than a kid having to go to a bunch of different websites and maybe get iffy resources, we can have a place that kids can go, they can use natural language, they can ask questions, and get good information without having to talk to a person.
Too bad we lost Des and Carol for the response to their question, but
Oh yeah, we did.
looks like we're almost out of time. I have several more questions I could ask, but maybe if there's, I'll just take a breath in case there's one more question. Okay. Well, I just, I guess in closing, I want to just say that your comments about the importance of, I guess, the human touch, I think are really thought-provoking, in this issue of the inherent empathy or experience it is to know that you're interacting with a human, no matter the mode. I mean, I'm going to sit with that for a little while, because I think that's really compelling and something to keep in mind as we try to have AI solve all our problems across industries. Well, thanks everyone. This talk is recorded. We post it on our YouTube channel, and it will be sent to everyone who registered automatically. So thank you so much, Laura. And with that, we can stop the recording. And thank you all for coming today.